It was December 16th, 1944. The fog over the Belgian Ardennes was so thick a man could barely see the next foxhole down the line. And on a low ridge above the village of Lanzerath, 18 young Americans were waiting in the snow for something they had been told would never reach them. The man in charge was 20 years old. His name was Lyle Buck Jr., a first lieutenant from Missouri, and the unit he led was an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. Scouts, not assault troops. They belonged to the 99th Infantry Division, a division so new to the war that the press would soon nickname it the Battle Babies. 6 weeks earlier, most of these men had never heard a shot fired in anger. They had trained in the United States, crossed the Atlantic, ridden trucks up to a quiet corner of the front that nobody expected the Germans to attack, and dug into the frozen ground. At 5:30 that morning, the world came apart. A barrage from roughly 1,100 German guns walked across the American line in the dark. When it lifted, out of the mist came a column of German paratroopers, a battalion of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, around 500 men, the lead infantry of the entire 6th Panzer Army. Their orders were to punch a hole and open the road for the SS tanks waiting behind them. Standing in their way were 18 scouts and 4 artillery observers who had borrowed the position. By every rule of war that the Germans understood, this should have taken about 20 minutes. It took all day. Buch's men held their fire until the Germans were close, then opened up from concealed foxholes along the tree line. The paratroopers, bunched in the open field, went down in rows. They reformed and came again. They went down again. Hour after hour, a platoon of Green Americans broke assault after assault against a force that outnumbered them more than 25 to 1. When the Germans finally worked around the flank at dusk and overran the position, they had taken dozens of casualties, and they paused, convinced the woods must be full of American soldiers and tanks. There was no one. There had only ever been 18. That delay, that single lost day on one road, helped throw the timetable of Hitler's last great offensive into chaos before it had truly begun. Buch himself was so battered and so cut off from headquarters that for a long time he believed his platoon had failed. He had no idea they had just fought one of the most lopsided small unit actions in the history of the U.S. Army. Now here is the part that should stop you. These were not veterans. This was their first real battle, and what happened at Lanzerath was not a freak accident. All across that front, brand new American divisions, units that had existed for barely 2 years, full of men who a year earlier had been clerks and farmers and high school kids, were doing the one thing the German army was certain could not be done. They were fighting like seasoned regulars, almost immediately, sometimes within days of their first contact with the enemy, and the German veterans facing them could not make sense of it. These were men who had survived Russia, who had bled in Normandy, who knew in their bones exactly how long it takes to forge a real soldier. The reaction that shows up in their letters, their interrogations, and their post-war writings is not rage, and it is not even envy. It is something stranger, a kind of bewilderment. They were not fighting the army they had been promised, and they could not explain where this one had come from. To understand why these Green American kids fought like professionals, and why that single fact left hardened German soldiers genuinely baffled, we have to go back almost 20 years to a question every army on earth thought it had already answered. The question of how you actually make a soldier. The Germans had one answer, and they were certain it was the only one. The Americans were quietly building a completely different one, and the gap between those two answers would help decide the war. Ask a German staff officer in 1939 how you build an army, and he would have given you an answer rooted in something close to religion. You do not build an army, you grow one over generations. The Germans believed military excellence was a kind of inheritance. It came from a long-service professional corps. Men who spent decades in uniform who absorbed a way of thinking from the officers above them and handed it down to the recruits below. It came from tradition, the Prussian General Staff, the Wehrmacht, a culture that treated soldiering as one of the highest callings a man could answer. A real soldier in this view was formed slowly in the bone, the way an old craft passes from master to apprentice. You could not rush it any more than you could rush an oak tree into being, and the Germans had a fair claim to be the masters of that craft. Their army was, by wide agreement among military historians, the most effective fighting force of its size in the world. It was the product of generations of hard institutional work on doctrine, training, and the relentless cultivation of strong sergeants and junior officers who led from the front. When a German soldier looked at his own army, he saw the end result of a century of careful breeding. It was the standard against which he measured everyone else, and by that standard, almost everyone else fell short. By this logic, soldiers could not be mass-produced. You could conscript a man, hand him a rifle, and stand him in a field. But that no more made him a soldier than handing someone a scalpel makes him a surgeon. The instincts that keep a man alive and useful under fire took years that no factory could shorten. And by the same logic, the United States was almost a joke. This was not some private prejudice whispered in officers' messes. It was written down, and it had been written down for a generation. After the First World War, American intelligence officers gathered hundreds of statements from German soldiers and civilians describing their impressions of the Americans they had just fought. The collection was titled Candid Comment on the American Soldier of 1917 to 1918. In it, one German laid out the view of his country before the Americans had arrived. The opinion in Germany, he said, had been that America was a money-hunting nation, too engrossed in the hunt of the dollar to produce a strong military force, too busy chasing dollars to make real soldiers. Hold on to that phrase because it did not die in 1918. It went into hibernation and came back 20 years later, stronger than ever. By the late 1930s, the contempt had hardened into something that felt almost mathematical. When Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg on Poland in September 1939, the United States Army ranked, by most counts, around 17th in the world in size. 17th behind nations most Americans would have struggled to place on a map. A few 100,000 men, much of their gear left over from the previous war, scattered across sleepy posts. The German army that crushed Poland fielded roughly 1.5 million trained men and a doctrine of mechanized warfare that was rewriting the rules of combat in real time. So when German planners looked across the Atlantic, they saw exactly what their fathers had seen: a rich, soft, distracted commercial nation with no martial tradition and no real army. A country that built automobiles and refrigerators, not regiments. And the soldiers themselves were fed the same story. The men who marched on Lanzerath that foggy morning had been told a version of it almost word for word, that the Americans were a gum-chewing, undisciplined people with no stomach for a serious war. Here is the uncomfortable part about the starting point. They were not entirely wrong. The American Army of 1939 genuinely was small, genuinely was under-equipped, and genuinely had spent the interwar years starved of money by a Congress that wanted nothing to do with another European bloodbath. The German contempt was built on a real observation of a real weakness. Their mistake was not in what they saw, it was in what they concluded from it. They assumed that because America had no army, America could not rapidly produce one of real quality, because in their entire understanding of the world, quality could not be produced rapidly. Quality had to be grown. The very idea of manufacturing it was to them a contradiction in terms. What the Germans did not know, because almost nobody outside a handful of quiet American army posts knew, was that during those same lean interwar years, a small group of American officers had become quietly obsessed with the opposite question. Not how to grow a soldier slowly over a career, but how to manufacture a competent one quickly at industrial scale. By the millions, if it came to that. To most military men of the era, it sounded faintly ridiculous, like proposing to mass-produce concert violinists on an assembly line. You can understand why the rest of the world waved it away. The rest of the world was about to discover it had waved away the future. Because the first place this strange new American machine would be tested was not a quiet training field at home. It was a mountain pass in Tunisia against the most famous general in the German army. And the result there was so humiliating, so complete, that for a few weeks in 1943, it looked as though the Germans had been right about the Americans all along. The man who would have to turn a nation of civilians into an army was not a household name then, and he is not one now. But George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, called him the brains of the Army. His name was Leslie McNair. McNair was a lieutenant general with a field artillery background, a precise, undramatic man with a reputation for cold competence rather than charisma. In 1942, he was handed one of the largest tasks in the history of warfare: The U.S. Army stood at a few 100,000 men. It would have to swell past 8 million. And McNair, as commander of Army Ground Forces, was given responsibility for an enormous share of how those millions would be trained for combat. At its peak, his command was the largest training organization the United States had ever assembled. Now think about the problem honestly, because it is genuinely brutal. You cannot grow 8 million soldiers the German way. There is not enough time, and there are nowhere near enough veterans to hand the craft down man to man. The professional corps of the old American Army was a thin film of experienced men spread across an ocean of newcomers. By the German theory, this was hopeless from the start. You would get 8 million armed civilians, not an army. The American answer, the answer of the whole system McNair helped drive, was to reject the German premise entirely. If you cannot grow soldiers slowly, then you engineer them deliberately, the way Detroit engineered automobiles. You break being a soldier down into specific, teachable tasks. You standardize exactly how each task is taught, so that a recruit in Georgia and a recruit in California learn the identical skill in the identical way. You write all of it down in manuals so detailed that the knowledge no longer lives only in the heads of veterans. It lives on paper where it can be copied a million times over. And then you run human beings through that system on a fixed schedule, like a product moving down a line. This is the mechanism. This is the answer to the puzzle that would baffle the Germans. Not a warrior soul handed down through the generations, but a pipeline. The scale tells you how seriously the Americans took it. By 1941, they had built around 21 replacement training centers across the country. By April 1945, roughly 2.5 million enlisted men had graduated from the replacement training agencies of the combat arms alone, and the training kept getting longer and more demanding as the Americans learned what actually worked. Early on, men got only a few weeks. A 14-week cycle was approved in June 1943, and in August, the cycle was set at 17 weeks. The additional time was poured into tactical work out in the field. The system was not frozen. It studied itself and improved the way a factory refines its process. To picture what that looked like on the ground, take just one of these places. Camp Roberts in California, halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles, was the largest Army basic training installation in the entire country. It boasted what was said to be the world's largest parade field, as long as 14 football fields laid end to end. At its peak in 1944, it held around 45,000 men at once, many of them quartered in vast cities of tents. And across the war, more than 430,000 troops passed through its intensive 17-week cycle, 430,000 out of one camp. There were others like it: Fort McClellan in Alabama, Camp Wheeler in Georgia, Camp Blanding in Florida, Camp Fannin and Camp Howes in Texas. Think of them as the plants of a continent-spanning production system, each one taking in civilians at one end and turning out trained infantrymen at the other, all of them building to the same specification. And every man knew what the product was for. As one modern Army officer put it, the soldiers trained at these centers knew exactly where they were going, to the deadliest places on the battlefield. They were not being prepared for a parade. They were being manufactured deliberately to replace the dead. And the training was not the polite parade ground drill of peacetime. McNair pushed hard for it to be tough and realistic, what the Army called battle inoculation. Recruits crawled under live machine gun fire. They moved through obstacle courses and mock villages with real ammunition cracking around them. There were even live fire demonstrations where men assaulted a fake German town as bullets flew. The whole point was to introduce a man to the noise and chaos and fear of combat before the enemy did, so that the first time he heard a bullet snap past his head was not the first time he had to think clearly while terrified. Here is what that produced, and here is why it answers our question. A German recruit's competence came largely from the veterans around him and the tradition he was being absorbed into. That is powerful, but it is slow, and it cannot be scaled because there are only so many veterans to go around. An American recruit's competence was built into him directly by the system before he ever met a veteran. He arrived at his unit already carrying a standardized set of skills that the entire Army shared. He spoke tactically the same language as every other American soldier because they had all been taught from the same page. That is a profoundly different idea about where soldierly quality actually comes from. The German located it in the unit and its history. The American located it in the individual and his training. And the second kind, unlike the first, could be produced by the millions in months in buildings in Texas, in Alabama, and Georgia, far from any battlefield. When the German veterans later found they could not explain how green Americans fought so well, this was precisely the thing they were missing. They went looking for the veterans, the tradition, the long service corps, that in their world was the only conceivable source of competence. They could not find it because in the American system, it had been quietly replaced by something they had never built and could barely picture. But a blueprint is not a battle. And the first time this manufactured army met the German army in a serious fight, the blueprint appeared to fail catastrophically. It happened in February 1943 at a place called the Kasserine Pass. And what the Americans learned there, bleeding, retreating, humiliated, would end up mattering more than any victory could have. In February 1943, the U.S. Second Corps in Tunisia ran headlong into Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and his battle-hardened Africa Corps. The Americans were green. Their commanders were inexperienced. Their units were scattered and badly coordinated. And the doctrine that looked so clean on paper came apart on contact with a master of maneuver. Kasserine Pass was a disaster. American positions were torn open. More than 6,000 men were lost. The retreat was confused and in places panicked. To the watching world and to plenty of British and German observers, it looked like brutal confirmation of everything they had always believed. The amateurs had been handed a textbook beating by the professionals. The factory had produced exactly what the Germans predicted it would. Armed civilians who folded the moment a real army pushed on them. And Rommel, after the first contact, was not impressed by the rawness he saw in front of him. He is reported to have remarked that he had never seen troops so badly prepared for combat. The German confidence looked entirely justified. But this is the turn in the story. This is the part the German theory of armies simply could not account for, and the part that ultimately doomed it, because the Americans did not break and stay broken. They studied the beating. In the weeks after Kasserine, the U.S. Army did something institutional and almost cold-blooded. It treated the defeat as data. Commanders who had failed were relieved. The cooperation between infantry, armor, and artillery that had fallen apart was drilled and re-drilled until it was reflex. The lessons were written down, and because the Army ran on standardized doctrine and shared manuals, those lessons could be pushed out to every unit, not just the ones that had been mauled in Tunisia. The same system that manufactured soldiers could also manufacture corrections and ship them everywhere at once. The recovery was startlingly fast. Within a matter of weeks at El Gueter, those same supposedly broken Americans stood and fought Axis armor to a standstill. Same men, same war, a few weeks of correction in between. The line that had collapsed in February was inflicting serious punishment by late March. And the most powerful witness to what happened is Rommel himself. After Tunisia, in the writings later collected as the Rommel Papers, the Desert Fox set down a very different assessment. In Tunisia, he wrote, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but it brought rich dividends. Even at that time, he went on, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, and he added that it was in Patton's army in France that he would later see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. Sit with that because Rommel has put his finger on exactly the thing that should not have been possible. He is describing an army that arrived raw, took a serious beating, and then improved at a speed no theory of slowly grown soldiers could explain. The Germans could understand a good army. They could understand a bad one. What unsettled them was an army that could be bad on Monday and genuinely dangerous by the end of the month, because that implied the source of its quality was not accumulated experience at all, but something further upstream, something the Americans had built before the shooting ever started. This is also the moment to be honest about the truth, because it is more interesting than any slogan. These men did not become elite after just days of training. The training ran 3 or 4 months, and Kasserine is the proof that they were not born ready. The startling speed was in something else. How fast a green American unit, once it was actually committed to combat, became genuinely effective. Days sometimes from first contact to fighting like a unit that had been in the line for months. The raw material took months to manufacture. But the final hardening, the step the Germans assumed required years of accumulated tradition, the Americans were achieving in a matter of days in the field under fire. That was the part that made no sense from inside the German worldview. And that was the part that left their veterans groping for an explanation. The men at Kasserine and the men who quietly studied their mistakes and fixed them were not fighting for medals or for headlines. Most of their names never made it into any book. If a story like this is worth keeping alive, the story of how an entire army learned the hard way in the sand, it helps push it in front of the people who care about getting the history right rather than the polished version. It means these men stay remembered a little longer. But there is a darker thread running through all of this, and any honest account has to pull on it because the same system that produced these adaptable soldiers also contained a flaw. A cruel, costly flaw that killed men who did not need to die. And to understand the full picture of why the Germans were so confused by what they faced, we have to look hard at the thing the Americans got terribly wrong. The flaw had a nickname. The soldiers called it the Rappel Depot, the replacement depot. Here is the problem it was built to solve. Rifle companies on the front line bleed faster than any other part of an army. A division that lands at full strength is hollowed out within weeks of hard fighting. Its infantry is shot away while the support troops behind them stay relatively intact. To keep those rifle companies functioning, the U.S. Army did not, as a rule, pull whole units out of the line to rest and rebuild. Instead, it fed in individual replacements, single men processed through depots, sent forward one at a time to plug the gaps left by the dead and the wounded. On a spreadsheet, it was efficient. In human terms, it could be a quiet horror. Picture the replacement's experience. He is trained in the States, shipped across the ocean, and then parked in a depot, a transient, a number on a list, waiting to be requisitioned like a crate of rations. His training quietly deteriorated while he waited, and his odds of survival in combat depended heavily on the reception he got in his new unit, and on whether he joined it at the front or somewhere behind it. Then one night he is sent forward alone or in a small clutch of strangers and dropped into a veteran company in the dark. The old hands do not know his name. They are not eager to learn it. They have watched too many new men arrive and die before they were worth the trouble of knowing. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who loved the infantry above all other soldiers and who would die with them on a Pacific island in 1945, understood this loneliness better than anyone. He wrote about the riflemen as just guys from Broadway and Main Street, ordinary men whose private world of exhaustion and fear could never quite be known by the people safe at home. For a replacement, that world had to be entered completely alone among men who had already built it without him. A company commander in the 11th Infantry Regiment, writing not long after Normandy, described the system with bitter clarity. The replacement, he wrote, is shoved from one depot to another and made to feel that he is merely added weight, which hands him an inferiority complex before he has even started. He is dealt off like a deck of cards into an organization, the commander went on, and the old-timers ignore him. And that is dangerous because the new man may be in combat within a day or two. Within a day or two. There is your after just days, and it is the grim version of the phrase. A man could go from a depot to a firefight that fast, surrounded by people who did not know him, sometimes barely able to recall what he had been taught. The casualty rates among brand new replacements in their first days were appalling precisely because they had been thrown in as isolated individuals instead of being woven into a unit that would look out for them. The Army eventually recognized the damage. In 1944, it began returning wounded men to their original units, rather than reshuffling them into strangers' companies. A small mercy that mattered enormously because, as Pyle saw again and again, men who hated the war still ached to get back to their own people. But the individual replacement system inflicted a terrible toll, and it stands as proof that the American machine was no flawless miracle. It was a powerful, imperfect, sometimes callous human institution. So why didn't this flaw sink the whole enterprise? Why, despite the Rappel Depot, did green American units keep fighting like veterans and keep baffling the Germans? Here is the new element, the thing that flips the entire picture. Because while the Americans were wrestling with the flaws in their system, the German system was not standing still. It was collapsing. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht had been gutted. The catastrophe in the East and the destruction in Normandy had consumed the one thing German military power truly rested on, that irreplaceable core of long-service veterans. So Germany began throwing together new formations called Volksgrenadier divisions, People's Grenadier Divisions. The name itself was a piece of propaganda meant to stir national pride and conjure the old martial traditions. Look at who actually filled them. Surplus men combed out of the shrinking Navy and Air Force, wounded soldiers sent back from hospitals, older men once judged unfit for service, and teenagers. Then look at how they were trained. Training was brief at best, sometimes as little as 6 weeks, though the men were handed some of the newest infantry weapons to make up for it. Some of these divisions, stiffened by a few real veterans and buoyed by high morale, fought surprisingly hard. Others, rushed into battle with almost no preparation, came apart the moment they were put under sustained pressure. Do you see the bitter irony? The German army, the institution that had built its entire identity on the conviction that soldiers must be grown slowly, that quality could never be rushed, was now doing the very thing it had always insisted was impossible. It was mass-producing soldiers in a hurry, except the Germans were doing it late, in desperation, scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel with almost no time to spare. The Americans had been doing it for years on purpose, with a system designed from the very beginning for exactly that job, and refined every month it ran. The nation that had mocked the idea of manufactured soldiers ended up manufacturing far better ones than the nation it had mocked. And now stand on Lanzerath Ridge again, and you can finally feel the full weight of the German confusion. Those paratroopers had been told the Americans were soft amateurs. The truth was almost exactly the reverse. The green Americans in front of them were the product of the most sophisticated soldier manufacturing system on Earth, while the German formations grinding into the Ardennes were increasingly green themselves, hastily assembled, padded out with boys and old men and cast-off airmen. The Germans expected to overrun children, and they ran instead into a wall. The mental map they had been handed simply did not match the ground under their boots. If your father or grandfather trained at one of those stateside camps or shipped overseas as a lonely replacement or held a frozen patch of line that winter, I would be honored to read about them in the comments. What was their unit? Where did they serve? Those memories are the part of this history that no archive holds. And once they are gone for good. There was one more place where all of this would come together. One battle where a single green American division, in its very first action, would stand against the cream of the SS and shatter the German timetable. It is the place where the battle babies earn their name, not as an insult, but as a legend. And it is where a hardened American Corps commander would write down in plain words the very thing the German army could never quite understand. Come back to the 99th Infantry Division, Lyle Buck's division, in December 1944. On paper, the 99th was an easy mark. It had been formed in 1942 and had reached Europe only in November 1944, with no combat experience whatsoever. It was stretched dangerously thin, holding a front far wider than doctrine allowed. All three of its regiments on the line with nothing held back in reserve. The Allies had placed it in that sector precisely because they were sure nothing would happen there. Then the entire weight of the German 6th Panzer Army came down on it. The 6th Panzer Army was the main effort of the whole offensive, built around SS Panzer divisions. Exactly the kind of hardened, dangerous force that by every German expectation should have rolled straight over a green American division and out onto the open roads beyond. Along its line, the 99th was outnumbered by enormous margins, in places by more than 10-1. It did not break. Cut up, partly surrounded, hammered by armor and artillery, the Green Division clung to its positions in those first chaotic days far longer than anyone had a right to expect. Long enough to fall back in good order onto the high ground at Elsenborn Ridge. And there, dug into the frozen earth, the battle babies and the units that came up to reinforce them planted themselves and refused to move. Day after day, the Germans pounded the ridge with artillery and threw infantry and tanks against it. Day after day, the ridge held. The northern shoulder of the bulge, the hinge the entire German plan depended on prying open, never gave way. When it was over, the cost to the Germans in that sector was staggering. Thousands of dead and the burned-out wreckage of roughly 60 tanks and assault guns scattered across the snow. The shoulder held. the German offensive, unable to break north, was funneled and squeezed and starved of the roads it needed. And the great gamble in the Ardennes began to die against, among others, a division that had not even existed 3 years earlier. 2 months later, when the 99th was transferred to another corps, the 5th Corps commander, Major General Clarence Hubner, a tough old soldier who had first gone into combat back in the First World War, wrote to the division's commander. His letter opened with the simple, devastating fact at the heart of this entire story. The 99th Infantry Division, he wrote, arrived in this theater without previous combat experience early in November 1944. Without previous combat experience. And it had just helped break the back of Hitler's last offensive in the West. So now we can finally answer the question we started with. Why were German veterans so puzzled that American recruits fought like regulars almost immediately? Notice the word, because it is the right one. Not angered. They had been angry at enemies before. Not envious. Envy is what you feel towards someone who simply has more than you do. Puzzlement is something else entirely. Puzzlement is what an intelligent man feels when reality refuses to fit the model in his head, when the thing he knows to be impossible is happening right in front of him. The German veteran knew, the way he knew the sun would rise, that you cannot make a real soldier quickly. His whole army, his whole tradition, his whole sense of who he was rested on that single truth. A soldier was grown over years inside a unit, inside a culture handed down through generations. There was no other way. Everyone knew there was no other way. And then a nation he'd been taught to dismiss as soft and money-grubbing sent against him young men who had been civilians a year before. And they fought like men who had been at it for a decade. He went looking for the explanation he expected. He looked for the veterans, the long service, the deep tradition. They were not there. There was only this thing the Americans had built quietly out in the desert and on the prairie through the lean interwar years. A system that treated the making of a soldier not as a sacred, slow craft, but as a problem of engineering and scale, and then went out and solved it. That is the answer, and it deserves to be said in plain words. It was not the courage of the individual American that puzzled the Germans, though the courage was real and the men at Lanzerath proved it. It was that the courage arrived already trained. The competence came factory fresh before the veterans, before the experience, manufactured far upstream by a system the German army had never thought to build because it had spent a century certain that such a thing could not exist. The Germans were not confused by brave men. They had faced brave men everywhere. They were confused by a new idea about where brave, competent men come from. They were losing to a blueprint, and the final bitter proof is what happened to the Germans themselves. By 1945, they were doing exactly what they had sworn could never be done, rushing half-trained teenagers and old men into hastily built new divisions, and doing it badly because they had refused to learn the lesson until it was forced on them at gunpoint. The Americans had simply understood it sooner. They had built for it, and that head start helped win a war. In the end, the Germans were right about one thing. Most soldiers are not born, but they were wrong about all the rest. A soldier does not have to be grown slowly over generations. He can be made deliberately at scale by a nation that decides to take the job seriously. The men of the 99th, the 18 scouts on Lanzerath Ridge, the lonely replacements who walked toward the sound of the guns surrounded by strangers, they were the proof, not numbers in a manual. Men made into soldiers faster than the enemy ever believed was possible. If this story changed how you view the courage and the machinery behind the common soldier, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the deep history that others have tried to bury. Help us cultivate the truth for the future. The next treasury of history will be opened soon.